Father, thank you for the way you've already blessed us with our time here. Thank you for the way you've blessed me for the opportunity to meet so many neat brothers and sisters in Christ and people who are in the front lines of the spiritual battles for our country, working at universities. Father, we pray that you would give us energy this late in the day when we're tired and ready to go home, and that you might continue to teach us through the things that are going to be shared this afternoon. For it's in Jesus' precious name that we pray. Amen. Okay, that's my prayer. You won't go to sleep. So, building a successful research career. Now, I'm going to start with research, not because I don't think teaching is important. Teaching is very important. And I would say, as a matter of my Christian testimony, I want to be a very, very good teacher. The first day of class, when I identify myself as a Christian, and I always add to that, and I hope you'll see it makes a difference in how I treat you. Now, I really shouldn't say that unless I'm going to really do a good job of teaching, right? Because if I promise that and then I do a really crummy job and they'll say, well, I can see being a Christian doesn't make much difference in how you teach because that was terrible, and so don't say that unless you intend to back it up. But I think the way to be a good teacher is something that probably all of you know plenty about, and it's a lot dependent on simply putting in the right amount of time to prepare good lectures, to write good exams, and to be available with your students. I'll mention one thing in that regard. Students don't understand that the requirements for faculty today is generally to teach and do research. And students think that you should be full-time available 40 hours a week for help or whatever. And of course, when I post my schedule on the door, I have 20 hours that are marked out I'm not available. And I don't want them to think I'm just halfway committed to being a good teacher. I tell them my salary is paid 20 hours a week to teach you and 20 hours a week to do something else. And if I spend all my time helping you, then I'm cheating to something else. And so you can be sure I'm 50% available half of the time, but not the other half. And once the students understand that, then there isn't really a problem, and they appreciate that clarification because I don't want them to misinterpret that. And then I enjoy having students come by, but I also enjoy having them come by at particular times so I can plan my week, because I may have some big rock things that really need to get done too. And if I have interruptions, random interruptions 40 hours a week, I will not get those other things done. Okay, let's talk about building a successful research career. I'm going to start with my own experience, and then I'm going to generalize that because a lot of you are going to say, I don't know anything about materials and I don't really care, so this isn't very helpful. I'm going to use this and then make a more general, I think, inference from that. I think probably the most important thing that happened to me, and I'm going to say it happened to me because I wasn't smart enough to go out and do this on my own. I taught for 8 years at the Colorado School of Mines. I was in a metallurgical engineering department. My research efforts there were by and large on metals and alloys, trying to do things like make better properties, predicting how long things will last. For example, if you fly on an airplane, you would like to know that the wing will not fall off. And in fact, sometimes, planes fly with cracks. That should worry you. I've actually had the experience of walking across at one of these small airports, and you see the plane you're boarding, and you notice they have a little crack on the wing, and they have a little yellow marker on it, and it's like, oh, this has a crack, but at least they know it's there, and at least they're paying attention. Now, the kind of stuff I did was to say, how much longer before this wing's going to fall off, right? And as somebody who works in that field, I actually went home and did some calculations on high-performance aluminum alloys. I wanted to say, how big is the crack, going to be before it breaks? But the problem with staying in that field was that people have been doing a lot of research on metals and alloys since about the 1940s. A lot of that was motivated by the fact that we had a lot of ships made during World War II out of steel that was not as good as it needed to be for some subtle reasons, and a lot of ships literally did this. They cracked in two. A whole bunch of them, like they made 400 and like 40 of them, or maybe 50, broke into two pieces. Wouldn't you feel bad if you were on a ship and it just went, and then it's in two pieces? And yeah. So it was an interesting area, but it also had been studied a lot for a long time. And in a rather interesting way, I had a good friend at the church I went to when I moved to Texas A&M who was working in a very different area. He was working in the area of high-performance graphite epoxy composites. And he asked me if I would like to be on an Air Force contract that he was writing for a center. Turns out he was one of the best-known experts in the world on the sort of solid mechanics of this, but he was looking for somebody with a materials background. And since we were already good friends and both Christians, he had invited me to join with him in that project. And it was one of those providential things, because I would probably have never have thought to do that unless I watched that movie, The Graduate. Have y'all heard of the movie, The Graduate? And when they ask, you know, what's the future, and the one-word answer was what? Plastics, okay. It was very prophetic, 1968. That was actually a great year to buy stock or to get training or whatever in that area. But I didn't see the movie, see, so I had missed that. I only heard about it later. And what was good about that was that at that time, they weren't using plastics for things that were load-bearing. They were using it for dashboards on cars and other things, but it was a more limited kind of, you know, bags to take out your stuff at the store, maybe for garbage bags, but nothing that was load-bearing, nothing that was critical in terms of if it failed, so what? So this was a perfect time to get in. And it was really, really a great opportunity, because the work that we did in the center that the Air Force sponsored put us way ahead of almost all of the other people who were working in this field or got into it. We had one of the 4 or 5 major programs in the United States in high-performance composite materials. What was nice about that is, if you're the first one into the orchard, there's lots of low-hanging fruit. If you're the last one into the orchard, there's a little fruit, and it's way high, and you climb all the way up there, and it still isn't a very good piece of fruit. And so I think probably the biggest mistake I have seen, and again, during my 4 years as department head, I had 67 faculty, and it was interesting to see that some of the people that I know just from knowing them, they're really, really smart, and they came from, you know, top 3 or 4 engineering programs in the country, and seemed really smart, but they weren't doing very well, and the reason was, what were they doing? They were doing what they did on their dissertation. Why? Because that's what they already knew something about. But it may be what they did on their dissertation was at the end of its usefulness in terms of research, and so they were sort of flogging the dead horse, so to speak. It's crucial, I think, if you want to have a successful research career, to look around and find new emerging areas that are at the beginning of what is going to be a nice run. You cannot do that by simply being in a place where there isn't good opportunity. I like to think of it like gold mining. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care how capable you are. I don't care how diligently you work. If the gold mine is out of gold, it is not going to make any difference, okay? And it's so easy to make that mistake. And so I think what you need to do is to really pray and ask God to guide and direct you into new, fertile, useful areas of research, because it will make such a big difference in your career in 2 ways. One way is it's nice to do some really original, significant research, but it's also easier in the sense that if you're one of the early people into the orchard, you don't have to write 5 proposals to get 1 funded. I know when I retired several years ago that the funding rate at NSF, in engineering at least, was on the order of like 15% of the proposals. That's not very high. And that means you have to write 5 or 6 proposals on average to get funded. So you spend all your time writing proposals, and that's a good way to ruin your life. So by being first into the orchard, I literally went 10 years without ever writing a proposal that didn't get funded. 10 wonderful years. And then the next years, other people were getting into the orchard, but I still had almost every proposal I wrote funded. I had companies like 3M and DuPont who were coming to me with money saying, would you do some of this on our materials? And we'd say, well, yeah. How much money do you have? Oh, $75,000. Well, that's reasonable, okay? 1-page proposal and then a 2 or 3 page report, you know, it's pretty good money. And again, I think the point here was not that I was smart or clever. The point was that by God's grace, okay, I didn't go out and even find this. My friend at church was the one that got me into it. As a second example, I had a graduate student who he won a National Merit Scholarship to go to graduate school. He was a neat Christian from in Idaho someplace, and he came to Texas A&M because he'd heard me speak at some Christian conference, and he wanted to do a PhD in my area, but he wanted to do it with a Christian professor, and so he came to work with me. Really, really neat kid. Had like 1550 on his GREs and stuff, so when somebody calls you up and says, could I be your student, well, what's your record? Oh, okay, fine. Yes, you can be my student, and I'll find some money for that. Well, by this time, I've been doing composite materials for 15 years. Now, the path of least resistance is what? Keep on keeping on, but that's not going to be best for him because I knew he wanted to get a PhD because he wanted to go and be able to have a Christian influence. And that's a great way to do it, as we all know. And so I had an idea of a new area, which at the time was not very established at all. It was just beginning to get started, called rapid prototyping. Most of you have heard about rapid prototyping. It's becoming widely used in industry today, but at the time it was brand new and nobody knew very much about it. And so I wrote a proposal for that and sent it to NSF, and then I wrote a second proposal. One was a general one for manufacturing, and a second one was a special thing for sort of a new and emerging kinds of technology. So I wrote more or less the same proposal and sent it to both places so I'd have two chances. I'm playing tennis with him one day, which we did occasionally, and I said, Brent, are you praying that your proposal will get funded? And he said, no, I just pray for the guys in my Bible study. And I said, look, you better pray that this proposal gets funded, because if it doesn't get funded, guess what you're going to do? High-performance composite materials. But I don't think that's the best place for you to be. So I said, pray hard, because this is a new emerging area, and you can be first into the orchard. And by God's grace, it got funded. In fact, it got funded in both competitions, and they called me and said, you have two proposals here that look like they're the same one, more or less. And I said, yeah, more than less. And so they said, it's the only time I ever had you go to NSF, you get maybe 1 in 5 proposals funded normally. And so I got it in 2 different competitions. That's like 1 in 25 statistically. And then we had a great time doing the research that we proposed. We got a patent, sold it to a company, and then he went off to become a professor. And he had a fantastic career. Why? Because rapid prototyping was becoming a really, really hot topic, but he got in very early. So my suggestion is, where possible, seek topics that are synergistic to your Christian worldview, and that's another consideration. That works better in some areas than others. It does not work at all well in some areas, but let me show you a couple of examples. Well, I'll come to that in a minute. Okay, let's say research is a gold mining. The most important step in being successful in research is the selection of the problem to be studied. That's even more important than just being smart, okay? Mining a tapped-out mine with great skill and diligence will not produce a significant amount of gold. Give very careful thought to the problems that are significant in your profession, and if possible, to the Christian church and worldview. And I'm going to share with you some examples of those too shortly. How do you find a gold mine topic? Well, I wish I had a simple formula for that. Here's the steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But you know well enough that's not true. It's a bit of serendipity. It means going out and beating the bushes and looking at a lot of different places. But you know what it also involves? I think it involves prayer. Because I do think that God wants us to be successful as His children, because He wants us to be able to be a good witness, and He doesn't want us to suck up all of our time trying to get dumb proposals funded and stuff, which leaves us maybe insufficient time to do the other things that He would have us do. And so I think God loves us, He cares about us, and I think it's perfectly fine. How many people do you know that pray about their proposals getting funded? Well, if you haven't been, you should be, right? Because in today's world, it's very competitive. It's not that easy to get money. There's way too many people writing proposals, and the money available has been pretty static for a long time, so it's become more difficult. Visit potential collaborators and sponsors. Become a very good listener. The year that we got into rapid prototyping, I was on sabbatical at NIST in Washington, National Institute of Standards and Technology. And what did I do while I was there? Well, I about 3 different times went over and visited with the people in my area at NSF, right? And it does make a difference to get to know some of the people that are going to sponsor these things. If you're not just a name on a page, if you're a face, and you can come in and make intelligent conversation and look like you're capable of doing stuff, then you're much more likely to get funded. We've seen the same thing when we've worked with the small business SBIR funding, and going by and visiting with the people there had the same, I think, positive results. You say, well, it's a long trip up to Washington and back to just go talk to funding agencies, but I actually think your department will almost surely spring for that, because I think it does help. Visiting with them won't help you get a bad proposal funded, but it gives you a much better chance of getting a good proposal funded, because not all good proposals get funded anyhow because there's not enough money to go around. I would recommend reading broadly and reading outside of the main domain of what you're doing. Attend national meetings. I like to focus on smaller rather than larger meetings. Gordon conferences, if you're in anything that has to do with chemistry, are a great place to go and meet people maybe in your area. Sometimes they have national conferences that have 20 different topics going on simultaneously. But when you go to a smaller conference, if it's a high-quality one, like the Gordon Research Conferences are an example in my area, you have all of your meals together with the other people at the conference. There's only 100 to 125 people allowed to come. And you really get to know a bunch of the people and get to visit with people, bounce ideas off of them, hear new emerging ideas. I highly recommend going to meetings, but if there are really high-quality small meetings, I think that's better than a big, broad meeting, which is every topic under the sun, versus one that's very focused. Be entrepreneurial, okay? Be entrepreneurial. My son teaches entrepreneurship, and happily, he was very entrepreneurial before he became a professor, because he started 3 small companies, all of which did pretty well. But then he liked what I was doing better than what he was doing. So at 35, he went and got his degree in business and entrepreneurship with 3 kids, and then he had one while he was in graduate school. So I told him when he left, he said, "You think this is a good idea?" And I said, "I don't know. At your age, with your family size." But God was gracious, and it worked out fine. He says entrepreneurship is nothing more than opportunity recognition. If you think of the people that really do well in the marketplace, they're people that they can see a gap in the area of what people want, and here's something that's missing, and if you had something to fill in that gap, then you would probably do very well. Most of the people that make a lot of money as entrepreneurs are basically doing that, aren't they? They're recognizing an opportunity that people haven't thought of. I think one of the classic examples is the selfie sticks. Now, I don't know what happened to them, the ones for taking your own picture, and all of a sudden everybody, I haven't seen selfie sticks much lately, but one year that got one of the 10 most important inventions of the year, and I'm thinking, and it's such low technology. I mean, there's nothing to it. A selfie stick, but those things sold like hotcakes, and somebody made a buku of money, and apparently everybody in the world owns a selfie stick now. But I don't see, have they gone? I'm not a teenager, so I don't know, but I don't see them around anymore. Now people just stand further back and do it, I guess. Again, pray. Now, I gave this talk in a secular setting, and so I basically added the caveat, if you think someone is listening, okay? So that's not for this group. I'm assuming you're all aware of the fact that somebody is indeed listening. Okay, let's next move on beyond the funding issue, which is pretty big. Why publish or perish? Now, I once saw a really, really interesting tombstone in a cemetery, and it had the following thing on it. It had John Smith, and then they normally put something under it, kind of what his life was about, and it said he published and he perished anyhow, okay? Now, I think that's a good thing to keep in mind because I don't care how much you publish, you're going to perish, right? So the main point here is that publishing is not the most important thing in the world that you do. Sometimes we get sort of caught up in that because that's the culture that we live in, right? But at the end of the day, I think when we get to heaven, I don't think God's going to ask me any questions about my publications. He'll just say, well, I'm glad you published something. That was nice. But I was really pleased with what you did to have an influence for the kingdom. Okay, so let me give you 3 ways of looking at this whole business of publishing. Now that we've agreed that you're going to perish whether you publish or not, but that's not to say that publishing doesn't have any value. A cynical view is it is a game that academics play that is without any practical significance. There is a certain amount of truth to that, in my opinion. And I can tell you, reading people's vitas when I was department head, I would see people doing things that really were game playing. They would take, for example, a simple experiment to measure the modulus of elasticity using ultrasonic waves, and it really wasn't even that novel. But then this fellow did 4 different materials, which would have made a nice paper in comparing the results. No, he did 4 different papers. The experimental technique on a copper alloy, the same experimental technique on an iron alloy. Why? So he would get 4 publications. Now, it would have made a more interesting one publication if he did that and compared the results and so forth and so on. And I saw lots of people doing game playing and padding their vita, right? And sometimes we actually review things in that way. We just count publications and say, well, how many do you have? 150. Well, that's pretty good. Well, the question is, how good are they? I may have 10 good ones and 140 bad ones. Now, I did have 150, but I like to think that most of them had some substance. But there is a lot, and I think sometimes I wish we had less emphasis on that, more emphasis on quality and less emphasis on numbers. Okay, so that's the cynical view. Here's the stewardship view. If research is paid for by the public, as much of it is, and I say that through taxes, all the people that I got money from, by and large, about 40% of my money came from industry, but about 60% came from Department of Energy, from the Air Force, from NSF, from NASA. So thank you for helping to pay for some of the stuff that I did. Stewardship view is if research is paid for by the public as much as, then we have a responsibility to make available what we have learned to the public at large by publishing in archival journals. Why? Well, some of the stuff I've done research on hopefully will be useful for people who are making products or developing new things. Hopefully I'm doing research on stuff that, if successful, provides new, interesting opportunities for commercialization. Now, it may be basic research, but it shouldn't be so basic that there's no possible use for it. And so I can choose topics that I think have that potential, and you really have a better chance of getting funding if it's interesting in terms of fundamental principles, but it's also particularly interesting in terms of what you might use it for. The stuff that we did on high-performance composite materials was extremely interesting to the Air Force for making fighter jets and for NASA for making all of the things they shoot in the space. Okay, a third view is I'm going to call the love view. God gives us significant insights in our research that are to be shared with other people to make their lives better and their appreciation of God and His goodness greater. I think that's the very best reason. I want to try to choose topics that, if successful, would really make a difference in how people experience life. They say, well, what can you do in plastics that would make a difference? Let me share with you 2 real simple examples. In about 1998, there was a huge problem. They started using plastic pipe for hot chlorinated water. Previously, they used metal pipe. The plastic pipe was cheaper. The plastic pipe was much easier to install, and so cheaper material, cheaper installation. It quickly took over the market. Now, the problem was the people who predicted lifetimes, they guaranteed this for 30 years. And the people who did the life prediction work did not do it properly. The pipe began to fail at 8 years. Now, it would have been better if it had failed at the first year, because then they would have quit selling it. So in the meantime, what happens is it's in all if you can think of all your plastic pipe in your house, all your hot water pipe, having to be replaced, how expensive is that? Well, it's getting to it, right? Tearing out all the sheetrock and stuff, putting it in, re-putting the sheetrock, so forth and so on. So I was involved as an expert witness in a $2 billion lawsuit. I was afraid people would be coming around trying to break my arm to say it's this versus that, but happily that didn't happen. $2 billion, and that wasn't all of it. That was just at the time that I was doing the work. We actually figured out how they had done this incorrectly. We developed a new ASTM standard by which they now do certified life testing. And so far, we haven't had any failures. Now, I thought I'm getting late in my career, so if this goes south, it's okay, I'll already be retired, you know. Now, and they can't sue me because I don't have that much money, but happily, the new pipe that they made, and we figured out how to do better life prediction, allows people now to have a much better plumbing system at a much lower price, and it will surely last 40 years or more. So we think that's, when I think of some of the things that I've done, I like to think of that as something that did what it provided improved quality of life for people. Isn't that what we should be doing where we had the opportunity, at least if you're in engineering? That's the way I look at it. Okay, so I think we can have opportunities, and we can pick and choose our opportunities. I prefer ones that I can see make a difference in people's lives. Building a successful research career, my experience as department head at Texas A&M. Okay, now I've been talking autobiographically. Let's talk about what I observed doing annual reviews for all my professors. And I don't know how long or how much information you get from your reviews. I used to spend an hour and a half with each person. I would spend at least an hour reviewing all of his material ahead of time or her material. And then I gave them a very, very careful write-up saying, here's the areas you're doing, and relative to other people in the department, you're in the top 20% or the third 20% or whatever. So they got really, really good feedback. So here's what I learned. Smartest people in my department, 67 professors, were not necessarily the most successful in research. Most hardworking people in my department were not necessarily the most successful in research. The choice of research area was extremely critical. Willingness to change areas as one's area became mature was also essential. More work in the short run, because it's trouble to move into a new area, right? Isn't that why we usually start off with our dissertation topic, and that's where we kind of launch out, but in many cases, your advisor may not have really been on the cutting edge of what was going on, so you were basically dotting I's and crossing T's on work that had already been done 5 or 10 years before. And if that's what you were doing, then it's not going to work. When I did my dissertation, it was on fatigue crack initiation in 6/9 pure copper. And it was an interesting theoretical study, but it was no practical value. 6/9 pure copper is going to be so soft, you really can't build anything out of it. So I immediately changed to a different area when I got out of graduate school because I thought, this is an interesting theoretical topic, but it does not have much utility, and happily, I didn't try to pursue that. Now, it was a lot of trouble to do a new subject area, but it was going to be a lot more trouble to try to get money out of something that really was dead on arrival. And then lastly, but not least, ask God to give you eyes to see fruitful opportunities. I just can't overemphasize that God can guide and direct us, and He wants us to be successful. He wants us to spend our time doing things that are fruitful and useful, and I define useful in a broader sense, not just as in engineering utility. Okay. Now, I actually had 2 research careers. Well, I had 3. I had one at Colorado School of Mines, one at Texas A&M, and one at Baylor. When I went to Baylor, one of the things I thought was interesting, I went there to start the graduate program, and we developed while I was there a master's program and a PhD program. But I wanted to do something that was going to be useful for poor people in developing countries. And I had no idea of what that might be because everything I've worked on wouldn't be relevant to developing countries. So I got interested in this whole subject area, and as one of the first things that we did, I was asked if we could help build a footbridge in Africa. This is actually in Kenya. You probably haven't seen this bridge, but it's there. and I can't tell you where it is because it's about 20 miles off of any paved road on some kind of a dirt road that was an access, because it was really kind of in a remote area. On the far side of the river, there were people who, maybe 300 people, who did not have access to health care. They didn't have access to a place to sell their products and buy other people's. They weren't had access to markets, and there was not access to schooling. Now, could they get there? Yes, they could walk 10 miles down where there was a bridge by another village, cross over and come back, but that's a lot of walking. And if you're carrying product to go to market and then carrying what you traded for coming home, that's a lot of walking with a lot of weight. So we were able to design and help build this bridge that was really designed for the circumstances here. And we used materials that we were confident would last at least 20 years. And the people on the far side of the bridge were so excited that they planned an all-day. We thought we would just finish the bridge and leave, right? No. They had this big, huge ceremony, and they brought in some political person from someplace else to give a speech, and they had a great big banquet for 300 people. It was outdoors, and they served mystery meat. I have no idea what I was eating, and mystery vegetables for that matter. But we had a great time, and they had dancing and celebration and all that. And it was really exciting because I went thinking they'll appreciate this, but I didn't fully appreciate how important it was going to be to that community. And the people were so gracious. Probably half to two-thirds of them were Christians. And it was particularly neat to me to think that we went to help some Christian brothers and sisters. At the beginning, after they had the ceremony, they had a formal ceremony, and then the first person who got to walk across it was the oldest lady in the village, the oldest person who happened to be a lady. So I thought that was really, they really thought about what they were going to do. And then pretty soon, it was like the whole rest of the day. We said you shouldn't have more than 6 or 7 people on this at the same time. You can break it down if you put too many people on it, and we had carefully explained that. It would have cost a lot more to make it impossible to break. And then they all took turns walking across the bridge for about 3 hours. Everybody wanted to have their first opportunity to cross the bridge, and we thought that was really pretty exciting. Here's the second area that we got into. I was interested in economic development in poor parts of the world, and they say when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I'm a material scientist, so when I look for opportunities, I'm thinking, I want to find something that grows only in parts of the world which are underdeveloped and doesn't grow in developed parts of the world, because if we come up with some idea to do something that you can grow in the United States, it's not going to help anybody in a foreign country. I need to find things that don't grow in the United States and can't be grown in the United States. And so one of the first things we got interested in was coconuts. Coconuts only grow within 20 degrees of the equator, plus or minus. Now, if you look at that band of material around the globe, it's interesting. There is not one country that would be considered sort of first world in terms of its economic development. There is one, but it's Singapore. It's very small. So we thought, this is good. If we could make coconuts somehow more valuable, then developed countries can't come in and plant a bunch of coconut trees and take that opportunity away. So we wanted to know, what are the unique things there that we might do? And so here I am visiting in Indonesia with a coconut family. It typically has a father, a mother, and about 6 kids. They make $500 per year. And I can tell you, you don't live very well on $500 a year. Behind them is a whole bunch of coconuts. And in a minute, let's see what they do with those coconuts, okay? If you break a coconut open, it has coconut copra, or sometimes called coconut meat. If you've ever eaten a coconut from the store, that's what you have on the inside. Then you have the shell, which is very, very hard. You have the coconut husk, which has lots of fibers, and then you have the coconut skin. So we were interested in figuring out what we could do with every part of this coconut to try to make it worth more money. Today, the only thing that's used significantly is the copra, which is used to make coconut, I'm trying to think, coconut paste, I guess. If you take coconut and heat it up to above 75, it becomes a liquid. If you go below 75, it freezes. It's something that's almost kind of like butter. Inside of the round part here, before you break it open, is coconut water. Have you heard of that? Okay, you get that at the store these days. Coconut water has become very popular. Coconut oil has become very popular, and the coconut oil, again, comes out of the copra. So there were lots of possibilities. At the time that we first started this, they were throwing the husk away. They were, by and large, throwing the shell away. Coconut oil was being used, and coconut water was being used. So we figured out some ways to take the coconut shell, grind it into fine powder. We could put it into some of the plastics that are used for door panels on cars or for pieces in the trunk as trunk liners. And this is actually a door panel that was made by General Motors as an experiment to see how it worked. And they did it at their own expense, and they did acoustical testing and a bunch of other stuff. Here's a bunch of other products that are still in process of being developed, but you can make children's toys. Anything that's made out of plastic, you can put coconut fiber or coconut shell in and improve the properties, reduce the amount of plastic used, and therefore it's more environmentally friendly, it's less expensive, and it has better properties. And so these are the kind of projects that we've been working on. A couple of years ago, we got an innovation award for the whole automotive industry by the Society of Plastics Engineers for the work that we've been doing. We've also started a company over in the Philippines in a remote area where there's lots of coconuts and 80% unemployment. And we've been able to create about 100 jobs. We also did something similar up in, or I should say down in Indonesia. Okay, so these are just examples of trying to figure out what can I do to help poor people in developing countries. And let me mention one thing in particular about that. To help poor people in developing countries, you need to help them get into the world marketplace. Poor people will never increase their economic well-being by poor people selling to other poor people. It's a zero-sum game. What you need is to figure out how these people can sell into the global marketplace. So today, the company that we started, and with the help of some other investors, and I'm one of the investors and I'm on the board, we spent about $4 million building a really very, very excellent production facility. We now have coconut oil being sold in about 1,600 grocery stores around the country, and with more options of people who want it. The coconut oil process that we've used is, we think, produces the very best quality coconut oil that's out there, and people who've been testing it and smell testing it for 20 years agree. So we just need to then increase our production, and we're in the process of trying to commercialize on a big scale the coconut fiber, the coconut shell. There's a lot of neat opportunities. Okay, how many of you are on a tenure track right now? Okay, 2. Okay, so some of you have already been through this, so I won't take up too much time. How to make tenure, understand the process, define the target, establish your goals, be accountable, things to do, things to avoid, access your motives. These are all out of a book by a good friend of mine, Ray Melchamp, called How to Make Tenure. When you look at these things, I think the most important thing is to really try to get a clear picture of what's required. And sadly, that's hard to do because it's not always well defined. What I did for my tenure track faculty when I was department head was to take examples of people who made tenure, but with their names whited out, and examples of people who didn't make tenure in the College of Engineering, not just our department. And then I would share that with them over lunchtime. I'd buy their lunch and say, here's an example of a successful case, here's an example of an unsuccessful case. It's a little complicated because it depends on teaching, it depends on research, it depends on funding, it depends on how many graduate students you have. But they could at least see some examples of what success looks like. And I think one of the key things to do when you're on tenure track is to get as much information at the beginning as you can to say, here's what the target is, and then to make that 5-year plan to be able to say, I'm going to achieve what I know is required plus some extra, okay? Because it's kind of, here's the bar, but it has an error bar, and you need to try to do that. We won't belabor this too much. I think if you look at your PowerPoint, I think the things that I have shared here are all things that Ray Mellichamp had in his book, and I think they're all pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not sure that I can add to what he said here. These are all things that I think are pretty straightforward and probably doesn't require me going through all the details, but understand the process, assessing the situation, define the target, generic scenario, code depends on a variety of things. How things count. Now, Ray put this in his book. This is not some universal standard. It's sort of illustrative, and so you shouldn't consider this as being definitive. It's illustrative, but it's probably typical at a lot of schools. How much does committee work count on tenure? Not much, okay? How about professional organizations? Well, if you're on a committee, probably not much. If you're an officer, a little bit more. If you're helping do editorial work for a journal, that gives you a little bit of credibility, but again, not very much. And you can see a bunch of other things here that are things that you might be asked to do, but I think if your department is paying attention, they should not be loading you up with this kind of stuff when you're on tenure track. And in a nice way, you might ask if you could defer on some of these things until you finish tenure, or at least not accept tasks that are going to be very time-consuming. Sometimes senior faculty want to give this to tenure track faculty because they're lazy and they won't want to do it themselves, right? And so try to avoid as much of that as you can. Teaching load, well, I don't think you get extra credit for teaching a heavier teaching load. Okay, things that really do count, okay, referee journal articles. I might add, I think Ray was in business, and maybe some of the information here is skewed toward business. But what you need to do is not consider this to be the target, but this is illustrative. You need to find out in your own department what are the things that are important and what is the relative importance of these. Michael Behe once said, publish or perish is a proverb that academicians take seriously. If you do not publish your work for the rest of the community to evaluate, then you have no business in the academy. And if you don't already have tenure, you will be banished. Well, probably true. Earl Grinnell's a good friend of mine, says journal articles get you tenure, books get you a chair. Now that wasn't true in my area. He's a well-known economist. But I never wanted to write books because depends on what book, I guess, but textbooks get you a lot of money, but they don't get you much research credit. Maybe if the book is very famous, but I think that I would say writing journal articles in my field is a lot better than writing books, and particularly than writing textbooks. Establish your goals, make them specific, make them written, and then be sure and include in your goals all of your life goals. Okay, so let me skip on through this. You have all this in your handout, and I don't have much to add to it. I'd rather spend the little time, if we have some left, doing some Q&A.